You're listening to a Comics XF podcast.
X-Men. Get it!
Hey everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of Battle of the Atom. This is your weekly X-Men podcast where normally we rank every X-Men story from A to Z, but instead this week we are talking to one of the editors behind a project that I was really excited when it came out, when I first heard it announced. Happened to completely forget about it, as many things do, and saw that it was for pre-release or pre-sale at the New York Comic-Con, and I had to buy 3 copies because when I mentioned people that it was available, I had a lot of requests for, I would like one, please. It's David Brothers, editor of the X-Men the Manga Remastered Volume 1, out now from Viz Media.
Hey, how are y'all doing? It's a very rare 2: title there. It's really hard to get approved.
There's a lot to that. By the way, Adam's here too. Hi, Adam.
Yeah, hi. I'm Adam, and I was one of those 3 people who at New York Comic Con was like, wait, this is doing what? And then walking over to the booth, finding out that it was sold out, and then immediately the next day hustling as fast as I could over to the booth, only to find out that Zach had already bought me a copy. So I think both of us are holding our beautifully bound copies right now, and we're excited to talk to you, David. So how are you?
Awesome. I'm good. I am fresh from London. I came from the UK. I was over for Thought Bubble convention.
Cool.
Exciting.
Thought Bubble Festival. I'm sorry.
How is Thought Bubble? Is that a cool con?
It's really fun. It reminds me quite a bit of... Did you ever go to Emerald City when it was like Prime Artists Alley? Like it was all about the artists. There were tons of commissions flying everywhere. It's kind of that vibe.
Okay.
Which is wonderful to me.
Sounds great.
That seems like the perfect vibe for things.
The weather was not as good. Speaking as someone from Georgia who lives in California.
Woof. It's the UK in November. That's not going to be ideal. So, David, I guess for folks who were unaware, tell us a little bit about yourself. You know, what's your background with comics? How'd you get involved in all this? Because you've got a lot going on, not just your work with Viz, but you're a podcast host on Manga Splaining with a bunch of talented folks, including Chip Zdarsky. You've got editing work that you have done for folks like Emma Rios. You've done some co-writing and stuff with very currently incredibly hot artist Nick Dragata.
Yeah, I feel very fortunate. I started as a comics blogger back in 2005 with my blog Fourth Letter with Gavin Jasper, one of my best friends, Esther Inglis Arkell, Thomas Wilde, a few others. And we just basically wrote about comics in public and kind of grew up as writers in public at the same time. So somehow that led to me getting a job at Image as proofreader, which led to me being the panel guy at Image and doing like 50 panels a year for a while, which is a ludicrous number, by the way. It's unsustainable, I would say. But really good practice for talking about comics and kind of getting your hands around how comics are made.
Right.
Like just talking to artists, like say 2 out of 4 weeks of every month about how they do their things. It was sort of like going to boot camp. And that eventually led me to Viz Media, where I work now as editor, and end up with projects like X-Men, the Manga Remastered Volume 1, which is, one of those weird things where you wouldn't expect it necessarily, because, not many people read it back in the day, and it wasn't like as high profile as other X-Men comics.
Right.
But it's still kind of cool to see. So I feel very fortunate that my life somehow has led to me doing cool things in my day job like X-Men, and then cool things in my off time like co-writing comics with Nick Dragata, doing little crime stories like Go Back. It's very strange. I can't imagine anyone else breaking into comics in my exact way, which is very much like through a window and by a back door. But it's been a fun life, and I'm excited to see what's next.
Listen, it hasn't stopped a legion of people involved in comics journalism from trying. So
yeah, it's true. And the funny thing is, I never wanted to write about comics. I only wanted to write about comics back then. I didn't want to make comics, which is why I'm doing this almost 20 years into my being in comics career. But it's fun.
So when you're looking back on like your comics origin story, you know, you were just talking about how few people probably read X-Men, the manga, when it came out. Were you a big
Mhm.
X-Men fan growing up? Was it something that you came to later? Where
Oh
did
yeah.
you encounter them for the first time?
It would have been shortly after Bishop first appeared was my first issue of X-Men.
Yes.
Because
My
I remember
fave.
seeing the cover of him and his homies like coming out
Malcolm
of
and
the portal.
Randall. We know their names here. It's fine. We're on a first name basis with them.
But as a kid, I was like, oh, that cover cost $7 because it was rare and I couldn't get it, but I could get the issue after by trading with friends. And somehow I ended up like coming across a copy of X-Men #1, which my uncle this weekend claimed is actually his that I took from him. I don't believe it. I think I got it from by myself. But seeing that Jim Lee art with the gatefold cover, like that is how you make a comics fan for life. Like I read that comic to pieces. I still have my copy. It's like in a little, I keep it in like kind of a frame as a joke with the Gambit side facing out.
Love it.
All the best X-Men are on that part of the gatefold.
Yeah.
And you know that dovetailed into reading a lot of X-Men comics. Like I'm sure you guys have had the same experience.
Mhm.
You know, good ones, bad ones, but like I just loved the universe. Like I loved the characters. I thought it was really cool how it was very international. I grew up in a small town in Georgia. I'm like from an Air Force family, but by the time they got to me, they stopped moving around. And I didn't get to travel until my late teens and early 20s. So it's like literally like looking into another world, even though it was kind of filtered through that kind of Claremontian loose stereotype kind of thing. But either way, I've always had a soft spot for the X-Men. When I quit comics and came back, actually, when I quit comics, it was because X-Men comics were bad. When I came back, it was because I heard Grant Morrison stuff was good, you know? And like I just keep getting rehooked by the X-Men throughout my life somehow.
It feels like that is an eternal experience for a lot of people.
Yeah, and it's hard to explain to people who haven't felt it because it sounds almost like complaining, but it's more like no, like it's like orbiting a sun or something, and I'm the comet, like slowly burning away as I approach it every time.
That's deeply relatable.
We get that.
So let's
Yeah.
let's talk about this project here, X-Men : the Manga : Remastered. How I know that there is obviously a big multimedia push for X-Men over the last, especially the last 12 months. But how did this remastering project come about? Was it something that Viz got access to some of the materials, like, hey, this would be a really good fit for us, or did Marvel approach? How did this get started? How did you get involved in it?
I think in hindsight, someone at Marvel knew that X-Men '97 was coming down the pipeline, like the cartoon, and that was definitely going to spark some kind of a reignition of interest, let's say, or
Right.
renewal of interest. From our side, we have a list of a bunch of Marvel manga from the '90s and before that have never been published in English or have been partially published in English. So we pitched a lot. We pitched Wolverine Snicked a couple years ago, which actually has a Nick Dragata introduction. It's a very all in the family kind of book, very handsome. And this is
We're
a
Snicked
continuation
fans.
of
We like
kind
that
of
book.
project. Yeah, I was so happy I got to bring that back. It's one of my favorite projects Marvel has done.
It is an underrated piece of comics. Like,
Yeah.
I did a piece years ago for Polygon that was talking about top 10 Wolverine stories or whatever, and we rank things on this podcast, but that's mostly a bit. And I was like, okay, well let's. I'm not just going to put five Claremont comics on there and like a few others. I'm going to find some weird stuff to throw in there.
Yeah.
And Snicked was near the top of that list of, I got to get this in because this is just, it's a wild, pure like artistry pouring out into the page. It like there is so much feeling into that. I love that comic.
Yeah, my good friend Jimmy Pressler was the designer on that at Viz, and he killed it. But we pitched a lot. We pitched. I know we've got other Spider-Man series going on. We've got X-Men series going on, and this was part of that package. We were like, "Hey, can we do this?" They're like, "Yeah, but we don't really have the files anymore. It was 30 years ago, and they were Cork Express at that." So we were like thinking about it, and that's a small complication, but we have access to the old Japanese tankobon that we could completely rescan at a very high resolution and essentially remaster it in that sense, in that way of going back to the Japanese version and keeping the Japanese sound effects, making it right to left reading order instead of left to right. Because the original issues, Marvel printed a lot of these in English. There's about 26 single issues, I think.
Yes.
Yep.
I should know because I transcribed all of them.
No, you're right.
Very long time. And they are again, like Snick, very much of their time. There are a
Mhm.
few like dialogue choices, maybe sound effects, edit. There's pages that are left out just to fit the page count. It's a
Mhm.
really interesting project from an editorial perspective, if you ever look back at it. But our goal was to go back and do everything, try to do as
Yeah.
much as we can from it. So we have volume 1 and volume 2 covers the first 7 Japanese tankobon.
Right.
Is coincidentally like a really good cliffhanger for the rest of X-Men the animated series.
Is and I don't have the table of contents for all the Takamon because I don't read Japanese.
Yeah.
But does that roughly equate to, because for folks who don't know, this is a manga adaptation of the animated series.
Yeah.
I would imagine, given where they fall, that's about the first season, which was around what they translated in English. Am I about right there in that ballpark?
Yeah, thereabouts. We go, I think, 2 stories beyond the English edition. The
Right,
English
because
one
the
from the
English
90s ends in the middle of a storyline. There's like 30 pages left in that story.
it ends like right before they get an adaptation of Days of Future Past, and I'm sitting here
Yeah.
as a junkie who's looking at this saying, "Are you kidding me? I could get a chance to read an adaptation of Days of Future Past back into the comics. I would like to do this.
Yeah.
I just couldn't."
And it's cool seeing this sort of thing from another angle. Like there's obviously the American adaptation of X-Men the animated series, but having manga art in this one from artists like Miyako Kojima and others, it makes the stories feel different. You know, even though
Yes.
they're more or less the same story as what you would get in the American editions. Like if you look at the to be continued page for volume 1, there's like this big drawing of the Juggernaut. There's an entire chapter in that art style, and I cannot wait for people to see it.
It is bar none
Yeah.
one of my favorite just things to point out in X-Men. Like, have you all seen the Juggernaut Colossus episode
Yeah.
in manga? Because it is a Looney
Incredible.
Tune. It's fantastic.
It's really fun. We've covered it on the show, and that's a really fun little bit.
Yeah.
And what you're describing, David, is a really interesting process because you're talking about not only kind of looking at what Marvel did when they put this stuff out, but then how to work in the original material. What kind of challenges come along with that? I'm thinking specifically about, the translation that might have been done back then. Was there any thought to, aside from adding material that didn't appear in the original comics, but appeared in the original Japanese version, were there conversations about, redoing any of that or approaching it from a new
Yeah,
angle?
definitely. I've got strong feelings about archiving and art. I think that the best way to do it is to make the best version of what we already had. So instead of doing an entirely new translation, we kept the original translation from, is it Masumi Mutsuda? I'm sorry, I'm spacing on her name.
I
I'm
believe that's correct.
jet
And I can
lag.
look because I have the book right in front of me.
Yeah. Like we kept all the original credits from the letterer, the editing. Yeah, I wanted to make sure all that stuff was still present because I think that it still reads very well, and it should read like it's from the 90s. You know?
Yes.
It should have a splash page where the X-Men yell, "Feel the wrath of the X-Men."
Yeah, like that's perfect X-Men vibes. But for like the backup material, for instance, all of that was included in the Japanese edition, and we
Okay.
hired David Evelyn, who works on a bunch of great manga for like Shonen Jump and Viz in general. He translated all of that for us, so kind of the perfect X-Men voice. And our partners at Marvel like Sarah Singer and the special projects team helped us like keep it inside, helped us like make sure we were on target with like what Marvel says the X-Men should sound like, let's say.
Right.
Interesting.
That sounds so foreboding when I say it like that. They looked over our dialogue to make sure we were doing it right, and they were like, yeah, good job. And
A little quality control doesn't hurt.
Right? Extra eyes will always spot something is what I've learned as an editor. That's why every book that goes to press, you will see at least one error somewhere in there. But we hired Brandon Bovia, one of my favorite letterers. I worked with him on a lot of comics like Transformers the manga, which is another TV show recap kind of thing. I don't know what that means about my career necessarily. I'm repeating myself, but he's a great letterer, and he brought modern lettering conventions to this classic script. Like there weren't really a lot of rules for manga in the 90s, so people just kind of lettered it however, but we kind of tightened up the fonts and the dialogue choices, we kept the Japanese sound effects and subtitled them instead, so you can kind of see how the artists were approaching it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the result is a book that in 2024 feels very comfortable to manga readers. Like there's no big surprise in there necessarily. And
Right.
even if you're a diehard superhero reader, you kind of know what manga is by now. In 1998, that was like maybe a 30% chance at best.
And to give some context to this project, back in
Mhm.
'98, when Marvel did, release the first, they did 26 single issues of it, like you're saying, they chopped and screwed some of it, they
Mhm.
got it all down, but it was edited to be a standard, read left to right kind of comic.
Yeah.
And that caused some translation issues just in terms of the art. You have to flip it. A very common thing that was happening in
Mhm.
English adaptation of manga in the '90s, but something that like my kids don't read manga, but they do know. Oh yeah, there's a bunch of comics that you just read backwards. It's fine. We all know it
Yeah.
now, and they're children.
It's a beautiful world now. There's such a like looking at the X-Men project editorial, the one from the 90s, and not in a critical way, just in kind of like trying to figure out what happened to it. There's a bit right after the Juggernaut episode where the art gets much more on, is it on brand, on model for the
Yeah.
X-Men.
Mhm.
It looks a lot more like Jim Lee comics instead of cartoony Juggernaut versus Colossus comics.
Mhm.
And it feels almost as if they got a phone call like, hey, what are you guys doing over there? Like, we need this to look more like the X-Men. Because it never gets that cartoony again.
Yeah.
And there are all these little bits where even like flipping it to read left to right and to fit in, like I say, a 30-page comic format. 'Cause some
Right.
of them are a little thicker than normal
Yeah.
issues. You're still not matching the Japanese page count of like 44 to 50 pages per issue. And you're also now introducing new mid-issue chapter breaks, which you don't necessarily want. So some of those single issues have like the first page printed on the inside front cover,
Mm.
and it goes all the way to the inside back cover.
Mhm.
And that's not normally how we do comic books. There's all these strange challenges from trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, when it turns out the easiest way to do it was just to do it the easy way.
So, David, in terms of starting point for this project, it sounds like you were working mainly from the original publication, as opposed to. Did you ever have an opportunity to access any original artwork or anything that was actually pre-production, as opposed to what was actually put out into the world?
I wish we had, because I love that stuff dearly. And after we went to print, like maybe 2 weeks after we went to print with Volume 1, Miyako Kojima, one of the artists involved, and Kojima, Kojima, she posted original art on her Instagram. Like she still has a lot of the pages. She has a side X-Men project that we don't have, that's unfinished in Japan even, that she's been working on.
Okay.
She
So they're all
did
these,
the
like-
Magneto chapter,
Yeah.
which of this collection may be my favorite art work.
Yeah, she's extremely talented. I was very impressed, and my hope is that we get to do all of that stuff. That'd be really cool. But unfortunately, this one was just straight from the published editions rather than working with the artists overseas. I imagine a lot of them have retired by this point, or maybe
Right.
moved into other fields. Moved away from the X-Men and haven't quite orbited back the way that we have.
No, I can appreciate that. That
Yeah.
brings up a really interesting challenge. Now, one thing, and I don't think we've mentioned this on this episode. Folks may know this just from other times we've talked about it. But one of the interesting things about this is when it was originally published in Japanese in Tokuban, they were 2 chapters per book, and each chapter was by a different artist, a different creator.
Yeah.
How do you approach that? Like, obviously from a remastering standpoint, you want to speak truth to what was actually put out, but just from an editorial view, what kind of challenge does that pull? You look at some like that Juggernaut chapter that are truly just wacky, fun things, versus like Kojima stuff, which is a very striking, high contrast, angular type of art. How do you have all that in one book and make it feel good? Or at this point, it's like, well, this is what they were doing. Let's roll with it because, hey, it's fun to celebrate that.
Yeah, it's a bit of both in terms of finding the way path and also finding the way forward and also rolling with it. Our designer on the book was Fawn Lau, who's extremely talented. She's been working in manga forever and has made some of a lot of the Inio Asano designs, like Solanin, I believe, was one of hers. And she brings like an excellent aesthetic eye to this project. And I think that she found the artist to focus on to make it feel like an X-Men comic from the outside. there's like a classic X-Men vibe, I think, that we hit with the giant X symbols and the way that Xavier and Magneto are kind of facing off against each other.
The very bold and striking,
Yeah.
yellow on one, blue on the other, which is unreleased yet. Big ol'
Yeah.
X. It's got that classic X-Men logo and really exciting profiles of these characters.
Exactly. And I think all of that together, like I'm from the blue team and gold team era. Like that's my era of X-Men. So I'm really happy we got to choose those colors for the cover. And the interior stuff has kind of a Cerebro vibe, like again, like a 90s strike files kind of thing.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
we took all of that text from the Japanese edition and kind of moved it around a bit and organized it into sections this way. It was much more like character summary for each volume in the Japanese version, while here it's more like a dossier. And I think that's kind of what brings it together, despite the disparate looks. It's in a wrapper that says and screams X-Men as loud as it can.
So I wanna ask this. This wasn't on our list of questions, but it's coming to me as I'm talking.
Yeah.
Especially in the 90s, there was a surprising overlap between X-Men content and Japanese manga style art. I think stuff like this, I think of I want to say infamous, but that implies that there's anything like negative about it. The Japanese animations for the intro for the animated series, which are bizarre and beautiful and fantastic and yell cry for the moon in a way that really speaks to me personally. And just because we recently just bought it for my kids and mostly me, the Marvel versus Capcom collection that has all of that fantastic, art from Children of the Atom and X-Men versus Street Fighter and all that. In your mind, as a guy who's both now worked with X-Men and manga and has come from that era, what's the connective tissue between X-Men and that Japanese style? Because it feels like, at least to me, there is a lot there that you don't see with like Captain America or Batman or things like that.
I think it goes both like from Japan to us and from us to Japan. Like
Sure.
if you look at Joe Madureira, for instance, definitely look at video games and manga. And I think that he defined that for the X-Men. Like he kind of brought it into the aesthetic, defining it that way. And though I would say also that Rob Liefeld and Arthur Adams before him helped prime the pumps a little bit because they also have that influence. There's a lot of Appleseed in all of the pouches and things like that. But from the Japanese perspective, the video games like Bangus and Shinkiro looking back at Jim Lee drawings and going, we can make this work as anime. Because like I think that artists, especially, it's a real recognized real situation. If you see an artist in one country who is crazy about an artist in another country, like look that guy up too. Like that artist is probably incredibly powerful. And in this case, they took that Jim Lee influence, that really kind of classic X-Men style, and made X-Men versus Street Fighter, which was one of the most beautiful video games ever. Marvel vs. Capcom 2, which has a very wide range of quality and character design, but is just off the charts amazing no matter what, I think it just works well because of that international flavor that X-Men had, both in the story and then also from its creators. Joe Mad brings an anime flavor to it. The video games bring an American flavor into the Japanese side, and then it kind of just all mixes together because we all like it in the end. Like we all want more of this stuff. And you can even see it in the influence of artists like Chris Bachalo, with the Mike Carey Chris Bachalo run with Humberto Ramos. That is like almost diametrically opposed to like the John Byrne Claremont era visually.
Yes.
But it still feels like X-Men. Like Rogue looks so good in those comics. The 90s just did such a good job of breaking down these different, I don't want to say cultural barriers. That sounds like way more heavy than it actually is, but sort of like these walls we had between lanes of artistry, between comics, movies, and video games, and said, no, all of it's cool. Let's borrow from each other. And I think that X-Men has largely been the best looking Marvel comic for a long time because of it.
David, one of the things stylistically that really sets this apart is the fact that it's not a color comic. It is black and white. And one of the things that it relies on really heavily throughout, regardless of who the artist is a really heavy use of halftone. And I do know that, sometimes working with reproducing halftone can be really difficult. I'm just curious, as I'm flipping through this book, I'm seeing a wide variety of different halftone textures and
Mm-hmm.
not even just dots. Like there are other pieces where people have clearly used different films and applied them. Did that kind of artwork present any sort of issues as you're trying to clean it up going into the printing process for what would become the final book?
Yeah, they can be an actual nightmare sometimes. It's the best
Oh,
way to put
okay.
it, like the Mori patterns and all that.
Yeah.
But because Viz, we publish thousands of pages of manga per year,
Mhm.
like our pre-press department, Brandon and Christy, our printing department, they're pretty familiar with that kind of thing now. So they can they've got processes to account for it. But most of all, having like a very high res scan goes a really long way when it comes to that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So we get the scan as large as we can, then we don't really have to change the size too much when it comes to going to press. But the thing about that is that all that kind of screen tone, it's like an art cheat code. It'll make a black and white drawing look like it's basically in color.
Oh,
And you can
yeah.
see it throughout this entire book. It adds so much depth and texture. And it's not a lost art yet. It's much more rare in the United States than it is in Japan. Like I've been to Japan and I bought a bunch of screen tone to bring home for friends and myself to use
Mhm.
over the course of a year, just because it's so much fun and so neat to see. And there are so many patterns. Like there's like a newsprint pattern that I've loved for a long time. There are the different kinds of dots, like you were saying. It adds a lot to the work. So we wanted to make sure that it would come through when we print it as well. So definitely extra attention paid there.
David, am I mistaken that the final format of the book is larger than the digest format that it would have been originally printed in?
Yeah, the originals are. I've got them on my shelf somewhere, but they're more or less standard manga tankobon size.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Japanese tankobon size, I should say. So like the Shonen Jump, slightly smaller than ours. So we
Okay.
size up a bit more than that for this one.
Because you
I
can
think our
really,
size is SIG. Yeah, you can really see the art, like you were going to
Yeah,
say. I
it's-
think.
yeah, like some of the halftone work, I'm looking at an image of Storm and I can see those individual dots so clearly.
Hmm.
It looks so, I don't know, just clear. So
Yeah,
you guys have
this
done
is
a
one of my favorite
remarkable job.
sizes to read manga in, or to read
Mhm.
comics in. Period. I think it's similar to the DC Compact Classic comic size.
Oh yeah.
I always blow the name of that line, but you know the books that I mean.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's very comfortable. It's not quite pocket size, but like it's like one step up.
It
Mhm.
feels like, well, and the one thing I like about this, I didn't like it when I bought 3 of them and had to drag them around New York Comic Con.
Oh yeah,
But what I did like about this is that it has a chunky weight to it. Like
yeah.
it feels like a book, even though you can, if you don't dwell on the art and all that stuff forever, you can read manga quick. There are
Mhm.
a lower panel density in general. There's a lower amount of just word balloons on a page. Normally, you can flip through it a lot quicker. But this feels like a good chunky read.
Yeah.
I had to sit down and spend a good part of a night going through it. Why did collecting it in this way, in this volume, make sense compared to doing like a standard digest style?
The tough part of a standard digest style is that we'd end up having to put out like 7 of them in a row. And the
Mhm.
longer you go, kind of the less you sell. But if you
Yep.
have kind of like a big archive edition, then that hits like a different audience.
Yeah.
And I think it also ends up costing less for that audience in the long run. Like essentially, you're holding 3.5 paperbacks in your hand.
Right.
That one book. It's 512 pages. I think both volumes are something like that. But yeah,
Yeah.
we wanted to have like a big chunk of comics, and if it didn't sell well, knock on wood, we wanted to make sure that like a lot of comics got out there on our first try instead of just
Right.
having like 200, barely 200, and then no more. You know. Because there are so many good stories in there. Like I would have hated to start this project and not get to the Juggernaut chapter.
That would
I
have been.
genuinely love that art so much.
I am so glad that other people in the world know that that's just like a good comic that no one thinks about.
Yeah, it's perfect.
But isn't that
But,
largely
Adam, you
because
had a
people
question.
haven't read it? I think that's probably the
Listen,
problem.
yes, but people haven't read a lot of things, and people have been talking about comics on the internet for quite some time, Adam.
It's true.
It really is a lost gem. Like it's really nice to work on projects like this sometimes because like yes, it's work, it's day job stuff, but it's like a fun challenge. Like how can we package this for 2024 in a way that's respectful to the original work, but also like appropriate to the market today?
Right.
and we kind of walked that line very carefully on this one.
And I would say, like, one of the things that struck me about this when I picked up the copy is that the production quality of this is incredibly high. It's got, I don't know the official term for it. It is, I mean, it's still a softbound book, but it's got a heavier paper stock cover on it that feels chunkier, and
Embossed.
it's embossed, it's
Oh yeah, the
glossy.
spot gloss too. Yeah.
Yeah.
The I mean, it's spot gloss, but it's a heck of a lot of spot on
Yeah.
it. It is the kind of collection that I'm someone who has now gotten to a point in my life where, like, I have a lot of books, and I want the good looking books to be out on my shelves, and I want to hide all the bad looking books. It's why I have all of my Hellboy library editions proudly displayed, and a bunch of Marvel trade paperbacks that have seen better days. They're off in a corner when I need them. But I would say, so was the production value of this, just something you guys looked and said, we want something that is going to appeal to that 30-something guy who wants to buy an X-Men book and have it look nice?
Kind of, sort of, yeah. No one wants to buy an ugly book, like you were saying.
Right.
And I think that Fawn's eye is so good. We kind of talked over different approaches, and she came up with something really cool in the end. And there was like maybe more 90s style, a little like more technical, lots of different art choices, like for the key art on the cover and back cover.
Right.
But the whole goal was like make it an archival work that doesn't feel uncool. Like I love old comics, but some of them feel like textbooks a little bit,
Yeah.
and with good reason. Sometimes you can really learn a lot from them, but this is more than anything else just kind of a fun romp. And you want a romp to feel like a romp. Like if you sell it as like a mid-century drama, let's say, it's not going to hit the same way. So we wanted something very bright and poppy, and yeah, I think Fawn hit it right on target.
Was it you or Fawn who decided to emboss on the back cover of it a line from the theme song to Pride of the X-Men?
That was Fawn, but that was also in the Japanese edition.
Was it really?
Yeah,
Okay.
it was a design element that they used. It's the Mutant Age has come, something like that.
The Mutant Age has now begun.
Yeah, that was part of the original Japanese design section, and we were like, we have to keep this. This is too good, and she found the perfect place for it.
That is fantastic. I thought it was just someone who had watched the VHS too many times and wanted to like sneak it in, because I also have had that line stuck in my head, but I did not. I had no idea that came from some of the original Japanese collections.
Oh, I was going to say, I think it kind of defines our book compared to the American version of these stories. Like it feels like a different angle on these X-Men episodes, and the Mutant Age has now begun is like the perfect slogan for that.
Well, and it's very, again, much love to Chris Claremont, but it's very much a statement of that exact moment of what these comics are. It's 94 when these are being created.
Yeah.
It's tying into the 92 TV show, the Jim Lee relaunch. Like that was a moment that defined X-Men forever. Like it's very difficult to escape the gravity of that.
The world was never the same after all this.
So was this project always intended? We have these beautiful blue and gold volumes that are being put out. Was it always intended to just be these two volumes? Because we know that there were additional stories that just weren't translated into English in that original X-Men the manga run. I guess what I'm asking is, will there be more?
I think it would be awesome if we could do more with projects like this, because there's always a risk of them coming out and no one caring, which is we were always worried about, and it turns out untrue. Like 20 people in the office also wanted me to add them to my comps list, so I know exactly where you're coming from with that earlier, carrying 3 around. But like when planning something like this, you want to make sure that it feels like it would be a good ending if you only get 2 volumes, let's say.
Right.
So I think if volume 1 and volume 2 do well, then we have got a lot of ammo to go back to Marvel and my higher ups and say like, hey, so about volumes 3 and 4, we've got a little bit more that we could do. But with those volumes, we'd be translating from scratch, which is like a different proposition. and there's more like you'd want to take extra care to get the dialogue right.
Yep.
And in volume 2, we do actually translate. I think it's a 2 chapters or 2.5 chapters, from nothing. But that's sort of following on from what was defined before. All that to say, I think it'd be very fun as an editor to do a project like that. So,
Was there a reason that you were kind of starting from scratch there, David, with those 2 chapters?
the Marvel versions from the 90s didn't complete the tankobon, essentially. Like it ends partway
okay.
through volume 7. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we were like, well, we have the files, we have translators. We're literally working with the translator right now. Let's get him to get in the mix as well, alongside the original, and have some fun.
That's exciting. Before you would come on, I'll tell you, as a guy who wants to find every weird X-Men thing, we had seen, I had found a list that said that some Patrolla X stuff had original comics in it, and I freaked out for a second. It's like, oh wait, am I gonna have to learn Spanish and find stuff that I could never read? And it turns out it was non-X-Men content that they added to it, which is great. I don't have to worry about that for my sanity. But being able to like experience something that otherwise could never and get that translated over, that's a really exciting proposition for me, and I do assume 5 other people who think about this series.
And 20 of my coworkers.
That's I can imagine that. Now, the one other, I'm curious, because you were telling us that you've got kind of a list of things that you'd want to get around to at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Is the never even collected X-Men Children of the Atom tie-in comic from Japan on that list?
I've brought that up. I don't know where the conversation ended. Like, that's something, like, as a fighting game fan, like, I would love to have all that stuff translated. I'd love to do an adaptation of the game. That would be dope. I believe that might be the Miyako Kojima project from her Instagram. I'd have to check.
Okay. Interesting.
But yeah, give me everything. Like, now that I've proven that we can do this, like, I'm down for whatever.
Well, I am hopeful that they greenlight more and more of this.
Yeah,
because this is the kind of collection that it's exciting. Now, one thing that I've always found fascinating about this collection, or this, I guess, adaptation, is that it's an adaptation of an adaptation of an adaptation, going from comics to TV to manga. So back into essentially jumping over a medium back into its original medium. And at the same time, nowadays, this coming out, introducing or reintroducing audiences who may have gotten into this through X-Men 97 or the Deadpool and Wolverine movie, or some of the stuff that's, hot today. As an editor, what are your thoughts on something like that? Because I imagine it, knowing your like writing work and stuff, you're a very formalist focused guy. Like, think about that. How do you read something like that, knowing all the extra context behind it versus taking these stories just on their own merits?
It's almost like it has a built-in fact check in my head. Like, I don't think it's out of line to say I'm probably the biggest X-Men on staff that worked on this book. I've got all this useless knowledge in my head. And so when you run into something that's like not quite right, or maybe could be punched up a little bit, I kind of know where to look to find the inspiration for that. But it very much is a snake eating its own tail, eating its own tail, eating its own tail at a certain point. Like running something through Google Translate through 3 languages.
Right.
And I think that actually makes it kind of fun, like almost a slight Funhouse mirror version of the original stories, or of the adaptation of the original stories, because it is very true to the animation, which I thought was really fascinating. Like, the Transformers manga we did went way off in another direction. Like, the Decepticons were kidnapping kids and all kinds of crazy stuff. But this is just like, here's the cartoon kind of retold in a very digestible way, and not in a way that like insulted your intelligence or left a bunch of stuff out. It's just very kind of smooth, I think. And you could tell the artist really loved either Jubilee or Rogue, depending on which chapter you're reading.
Yes.
They get the most love. And like, noticing those little bits and pieces are what makes it fun as an editor. So even when I'm kind of, in the dregs of transcribing every single word balloon and redoing the script, I'm still looking at something interesting, something that gives me kind of like a critical buzz. Because like, for me, criticism is kind of all about things in context with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Like Frank Miller being the best at drawing people jumping is something that I believe because I've seen other drawings. Like it's something that I've come to through observation, let's say.
Right.
From that perspective.
I don't laugh because I disagree. It's just I have a lot of thoughts on Frank Miller, and I don't think I've ever gotten to the point of he is the best at jumping.
I think so deeply about that guy. It is troublesome sometimes.
I had gotten to probably one of the best guys in American comics that if you ever want someone to fight a ninja,
yes,
like I've had him up there on that. I had not had jumping as a specific subset of that, and you're not wrong.
Those are very related. It's a sense of momentum in the air is the short version of that. And with this X-Men book, like seeing how people did Gambit, but how like sleazy he looks sometimes, like it really kind of tells you a lot about. I shouldn't say it tells you a lot about the artist. That's a little. It sounds a little like an overreach, but it tells you a lot about what they thought about the character.
Yes.
And just how cute Jubilee is in this comic is the place that the comics didn't quite go on our side. Like we have Jubilee, she's like a cool teenage girl, yada yada yada, and that was perfect for me. She's my kitty pride, like by every means. But in this book, it's like she's a straight up anime girl. Like she could be in Ranma 1/2 or something, and it's such a cool angle on the character.
I was going to say in American comics, you could not get the same page edit that I think floats around a while from the manga series. If anyone knows this, it's knows of the series. It's from this that has Professor X looking at a computer screen and saying, "X-Men, this is Jubilee. She is adorable."
Yeah, which is a Photoshop, but not out of line with what the rest of the series is like.
Yeah, it fits.
It's so close to being right. I was like, was this just like somebody did a scanlation of this and it got close or what? But no,
there's
continue.
a bit where like this is I guess volume 2 spoilers, but Bishop comes from the future and they see the graveyard and Jubilee's like, wow, I guess cute doesn't last forever or something like that. Just quintessential Jubilee. Like it's a different character, but it's the same character at the same time. I don't know, it's lovely. Yeah. And also, I don't know, seeing dope drawings is always going to be something that I'm fond of. And this is like, I think 7 different artists, or not 7, but several different artists working on the same things and showing us different angles on those things.
No, this is 7. It's 7.
It is 7. All right.
Several 7 of them.
Well, I think what you're describing is really interesting though, David, because like we do weird stuff on our show. Like we do cover just comics most of the time, but occasionally we do weird stuff. So like one time we did cover a children's book version of the chapter with the Morlocks.
Oh man.
And like it's fascinating looking at the X-Men manga version of that episode. And also then going back and reading kind of a children's book version of it, because, obviously in the original story, you have Storm and Callisto fighting with knives. They're not going to put that on TV because of standards and practices. And then, I think in the children's book it might be in the cartoon too. They're fighting with like American Gladiator, like Q-tips, right? And so it's fascinating seeing like the differences between the painted art in like a children's book version of that and like the way that Leech is drawn here. Because you can see not only the animated series, but also the comic book influencing what ended up on the page.
Well, I'd even take it a step farther and say from a like what is culturally acceptable at different cultures at different times. If you bring it up just to the incredibly granular point of what weapon they are using in the fight, in this, they're using like spears or bow staffs that are pointy and could stab somebody. There is an element of danger to this that I think was common and accepted as that's something that manga can do versus TV couldn't, versus American comics could at the same time, and how that all filters through one another is fascinating to me.
There used to be a website, I don't know if it's still up now, I'm pretty sure it was on GeoCities, but it had all the standards and practices requests for X-Men the animated series. One of the funniest websites on the internet, truly. And I would love reading that back in college. And if you look at Marvel Comics of the day, like of 92 or so, there's a bunch of bits where like artists couldn't draw people getting stabbed Like Rob Liefeld famously couldn't, or was it McFarlane?
It was the Todd. It was the Todd.
Yeah, it was the Todd. Yeah, it was their crossover. He couldn't draw Juggernaut getting stabbed in the eyeball.
Oh, right.
And
Yeah.
there's a lot of Marvel comics where someone gets stabbed and the sound effect covers the wound, which I noticed, which they swear is not on purpose. It just happens to happen, but
Sure.
maybe so, maybe no. Yeah, all those choices are fascinating to me because then it even extends to the pop culture references in the story. Like there's a lot of Americanisms, let's say, that wouldn't quite match the like Japanese culture at the time. And that's a fun choice of, do we add this back in for our audience who expects it, or do we go with what the Japanese audience received instead and try to represent that? And
Can you think of an
it's
example of that,
always-
David?
It was so far back in the scripting stage that it's been a while, and
Oh,
we
it's
mostly
okay.
tried to stick to the original, to the
Yeah.
actual with the original translation, just correcting grammar or things like that. But those are the kind of things that you have to think about when doing a project like this, because it's very much, who do you want to sell this book to, and
Right.
like how do you want them to perceive it? And in our case, we wanted it to be both the original Marvel edition, but just pulled a little bit closer to the Japanese edition that way.
Nice.
Well, I
But
would
not all the way.
I would say as a project, if that was your guys' goal, you definitely succeeded. I was excited just to listen. If someone would have put out a very low quality trade paperback of all of the stuff, I would have bought it anyway. But I
Yeah.
was thrilled to get something like this that is a piece I'm excited about, just like talking to people about. It's so cool. But this isn't all you do. You know, you got Time Waits that's currently coming out with Marcus Toe and Chip Zdarsky through
Yeah.
Distillery. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that one we are playing with a lot of genre tropes. A guy from the future, he's a corporate raider in the kind of a post-climate apocalypse era. He comes back to our time. He decides to stop killing people for bosses that hate him, finds love, finds a wife, kind of settles down, and then his bosses decide they want him back. And it's kind of a classic man pulled back into a life that he would much rather leave kind of story, but not done in the exact same way as John Wick or Nobody or various, Bruce Willis movies that I grew up loving.
Right.
We wanted to make kind of like a small town sci-fi drama. So we have we do a lot of wandering around the town, let's say in the first issue, kind of building a mood. But it seems like people like that kind of thing. Like we get Marcus Toe to draw some stuff that he never draws in X-Men comics, which I really loved. I was looking at X-Men comics to see what he was doing, like rereading Excalibur and his recent stuff and going like, where can we go left where they went right?
Right.
So there's a lot of that in the storytelling, a lot of that in the action. And, we just actually sent number 3 to press last week.
Oh, cool.
And we had like a nice dinner at Thought Bubble, Chip, Marcus, and I. We like Marvin Sienapar is helping him on art. Matt Wilson is coloring, and Ariana Marr is lettering with Alison O'Toole editing. She's kind of Chip's main editor.
Right.
It's a fun team, very small, and we just kind of went off, did our little crime story, finished it up, and sent it off. And it seems like people are really responding to it, like 48 pages each, which I think is a big help. Kind of like manga, when you have more pages for story, like it really kind of makes the story better, I think.
Right.
It's a really beautiful format.
Yeah, the oversized format. I can't get enough. It makes action really fun.
How has it been working with Distillery? Because they kind of are trying to push, I would say, something that's a little bit more premium than what you would get from like a monthly superhero book.
Yeah, it's like if every book was like a DC Black Label, at DC, that kind of thing. It's been very smooth. They don't really like have any input or anything like that. They're not saying like, hey, go this way with the story. It'll, make you sell more copies. They mostly just want us to do the story we want to do, which is perfect. And they bring such a great production value to it. Like all the spot gloss and stuff on the covers.
Yeah.
Number 2 has a really good spot gloss with Grace shooting at the bad guys and the guys in the back on the matte kind of window, matte paper. Like they just have a great eye for making a book look fancy pants. And every time, like all the different variant covers and stuff come through really amazing. My friend Emma Rios is doing one for number 3 that looks really cool. And it's like mostly red with like a hard black background. They let artists play, I think is what it comes down to.
Well, and speaking of Emma, you guys just had a book that you had edited of hers that just came out. Am I correct on that?
It's called Ansuelo. It's a 300 something page graphic novel about,
Wow.
again, a post climate change world. There's something going on, I
Look,
think.
we're all thinking about it. It's fine. We get it.
But these three kids survive a horrible flood. Like the sea rises up and takes back the land. And these three kids survive and have to learn how to live in what's left of the world. And it kind of goes in a lot of different directions from there. But it's very much about kindness when you're working with people,
Hmm.
sustainability in terms of the environment. Like, how much is too much when it comes to gathering food for yourself or hunting or that sort of thing? Is it ethical to hunt as a human being, or is it better to be a vegetarian? And there's a lot of kind of differing perspectives on that. But mostly, like, it comes down to how far would you go for your friends, like for those you love? How far would you change your life and yourself for them? And Emma's story is great, and her watercolors are even better. Like, she's so good. She just got a wild review in the New York Times today, so I'm really stoked for her.
That's great.
That's
Congratulations.
fantastic. Yeah.
Is there anything else that you think our listeners would want to know that you're working on?
Oh man, I'm on the Manga Splaining podcast with Chip Zdarsky, Christopher Butcher, and Deb Aoki. We're 100 and something episodes deep. We pitch manga to people who don't really read manga. It's basically a book club. You get to listen to four friends have book club for an hour or up to 2 hours, like our Born Again episode.
I'm sorry. Hold on. Born Again. Is that a manga that I'm not familiar with?
Yeah,
or?
popular manga Daredevil Born Again by David Mazzucchelli and Frank Miller.
Got it. Just wanted to make sure we were talking about the same manga.
We've done so much with the format of the show. We like to mix it up a lot. I'm always trying to break the format myself. But in this case, Chip was like, why don't we pitch a superhero comic, one of the best ones that I know? So he led the episode about Mazzucchelli's Born Again, which is basically perfect. And we talked for so long that it took me like a month to edit. It was such a pain. I will never forget Chip for this. But like, that's the fun. Like, even though we're talking about manga, there's still all of us still kind of know American comics at varying degrees.
Right.
So Chip and I share a brain. Like, we're Daredevil guys. Christopher Woodrow Butcher is very much a manga guy. He knows a lot of mangaka, but he grew up reading X-Men comics like we did. So he's very much like, he would fit in on this show if we had like a fourth guest tonight.
Right.
And Deb is also team manga, but she bailed out of X-Men in the 80s. So like, she saw like the Burns stuff, but she was really into like the Image era guys. So we have all these differing perspectives on American comics and also on Japanese comics. So every episode is like the gentlest fight in the world, kind of like a push and pull of what's good about the book.
Yep.
It's a delight.
I did notice, David, that at the beginning of Time Waits, there is a young man listening to your podcast, correct? About Chainsaw Man?
Yeah, it's actually, that should be a quote from the podcast. I think we adjusted a little bit in lettering, but I was like, why not just include like, kids love Chainsaw Man. My little brother and sister watch Delicious in Dungeon. Like, this is a real thing.
It's really funny.
It truly is. I would say that a lot of people, some of them aren't kids who like Chainsaw Man.
Zach is reading Chainsaw Man.
I don't read a lot of manga, just more out of, it's a lot to get into, and I already got a lot of stuff on my plate.
You're an X-Men fan. I get it.
It's a lot to read just to keep up with that. But it's Chainsaw Man and Full Night are the two that I have at least kept up with on the Tankobon. And
awesome.
Loving those. Excited about what's going on. Excited to get more of this X-Men, the manga remastered, and all the great stuff that you've got going on. If folks want to, keep up with what you're doing, is there anywhere good that they should be checking out everything going on in the David Brothers world?
Yeah, IamDavidBrothers.com will have all my various links and stuff. But I've got an Instagram called David Brothers No Relation, which I need to post to more often because I love talking about comics online. I'm on Blue Sky as at IamDavidBrothers.com. I did the little use your URL as your name thing. I'm a narcissist. And I am also on YouTube, which should be linked from IamDavidBrothers.com.
Oh, cool.
I've been doing little like kind of video essays and things like that about comics and music, and just basically doing critical essays in a new format, let's say, trying to learn how to do video. And it's a lot of fun.
That's exciting.
Oh, I do have more manga, actually. It's not X-Men, but it's
that's
Marvel.
Fine.
Yeah, I'm working on Spider-Man Kizno, which is a very kid-friendly Spider-Man comic where Spider-Man goes to Japan, gets blown up and merges with a teenager, and then the teenager kind of becomes Spider-Man.
Okay.
Like he's got like a Spider-Man ghost that hangs out with him and shows him how to be a hero. It's a lot of fun.
Whoa.
That's coming out next year.
That sounds great.
Is that aimed at a younger audience or?
Yeah, I would say like young teen and under, like
Great.
maybe middle school aged.
Great, because I've got one of those about next year that's going to want to read that. I can
Yeah.
tell.
Kizuna is Kizuna.
Well, we'll keep an eye out for that. Adam, what do you got to tell the folks in terms of the show business?
Folks, you can always follow me on Blue Sky and Instagram at AdamRec. We did stop posting on that other site, so just make sure you're tuning into Blue Sky and Instagram for any updates on the show. And Zach, what are we doing next
people,
week?
you can find me on Goodreads and also chess.com. If you go there, then you can find me in my glorious 450 ELO score. So
No kidding.
Oh boy.
I don't know if you know chess. I don't really know chess. It's not very good.
Oh, it sounded good.
No, good is like 1,000.
Oh, okay. Mine would be a 0.
I'm down in the. I beat a guy who just wasn't paying attention earlier today, and I was like, "Yes, I'm a grandmaster. Let's do this." It's the best mobile game I've ever played because it turns out a lot of people know how to play it.
Oh,
Yeah.
man. Zach, we should remind people about our Patreon.
We should remind people about our Patreon. If you want to request us to cover a great story from X-Men, the manga, Remastered, or any other X-Men comic that you feel like cursing us with, you can go over to patreon.com/Battle of the Atom at the $5 a month level. You can make us read whatever comic you want, and we'll do it. We'll figure out a way that makes it X-Men. And you can just support the show and keep putting coins into our coffers and whatnot.
Yeah, please
Adam,
support comics journalism. Please, we need it.
Yes, do that. Folks, like, listen, I'm not in the game like I used to be anymore, but there's some fantastic stuff that's going on. And, like, the stuff, David, just to be, like, frank, the stuff you were doing and some of the other folks in your cohort was, like, the stuff that I looked up to when I was deciding to jump into it.
Man.
Like, no, I want to be like these people. This is the kind of stuff, and we need people to materially support comics journalism for
Yes.
people to have the time and space to dedicate to doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm a believer, and that's very flattering. Thank you. We were just really trying to like create an environment to talk about comics in a healthy way, in an interesting way, because there's so like it's a high horse, but comics are beautiful. I think it's one of the best art forms in the entire world. Japanese comics, American comics, whatever. Mm-hmm. And talking to people about it is one of my most favorite things. When you reached out to talk about this book, I was like, I'll totally do this. Like, I don't normally do podcasts about day job stuff, but like, this is one of those things where it's like, this is right. This is like a home run for me. So I had fun. Like, this has been a great conversation, and I wish you guys thousands more, honestly.
Thank you.
Well, that's great, David. We've had a great time having you on the show. Folks, next week's David won't be here, but we will get to talk about Dr. Nemesis, including the oldest comic we've ever covered on this podcast by like a long shot.
By decades.
So, folks, jump on with that. David, thank you again so much. And until then, folks, this has been Battle of the Atom. We hope you survived the experience.
Get it!